All right, so we need to leave some room up here because his arm is up. So we're gonna actually do the 3/3 like in the middle of the page. We're not gonna do the bottom half of him because in terms of just practicing, that would just be kind of repetitive, and we just wanna kind of get down the technique of applying the shading techniques to the mannequin itself. So do these lines very lightly. When you get to your project, these lines will have to be extremely light so that you can erase them. So I'm just doing one top line, really light, you can barely see it. One bottom one. So it's like right here. So top and bottom. And this is the top half of his body, is one arm will come up here. And this section I need to split into thirds. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, but just make it as close to 3/3 as you can. I'm gonna do my lines a little darker so you can see them, but your lines should be pretty light. So I've got 1/3, 2/3, 3/3. All right, so we've got his head first. So we're building this the same way we always do. Just kind of speed it up a little bit so that you can start the shading a little bit quicker. So we've got the head in the first third, leave room for his neck. Shoulders. Remember, shoulders are usually 1 to 1.5 head width away from, oh wait, well, technically our mannequin doesn't look like that because he's a different build. So I'm gonna actually make him a little bit more narrow. His more like right here. You've got that middle upper torso. This is a little bit more oval than the ones that we used to practice with. And then we've just got that middle waist, and then the picture only shows like a little bit of his hip area. Next, we've got his elbow over here, and then it kind of cuts off, so his arm just kind of goes off the page. Now, if I want to measure out this other arm and make sure it's proportionate, all I'm going to do is take my fingers here, so that's the top part of his arm, but this arm's going up, so it's going to just move here. So this is his other elbow. And then I can kind of assume the other part of his arm is about that same length and go like this. For anyone tomorrow or later who's watching this video, we're working off the picture in today's post, Thursday's post. And then if you want to do his little scoop hand, you can do that, but the picture cuts off right here, so we don't need to go past that point. Now at this point, what I want you to do is actually erase those proportion lines so that they're already gone. We don't have to worry about them anymore. And that way we don't accidentally shade over them, because some people, they'll draw out their proportion lines and they'll do their whole project over it, and then they've got these lines going through their drawing. So you don't want them there. This one I'm just going to actually leave here just because that's where like the picture ends in this case. Normally though, we wouldn't. All right, so now we're going to start tightening up the form. So drawing it how we actually see it. So his head is more of kind of an egg shape. His neck is a little joint section, and this curves under. His body is also kind of like an upside down egg with a squared off waist. Well, it's actually kind of curved off. revise a little bit here. Even though I don't see this section, I've looked at it enough to know what it looks like. Then we're paying attention to how these overlap. Now this one kind of just sits right at the border there. And here I'm kind of combining that second and third step. So instead of like doing the loose like outlines and then going back and tightening them up, I'm just kind of doing the tightened up lines right away just to speed up the process. And then this shoulder rests right on the edge of the body too. Remember, what's important when doing each section of the arms is how that kind of intersection of the actual limb overlaps with the joint. So that will determine what it looks like that arm is bending toward. This one we can just barely see the ball joint because this forearm cuts in front of it. And then it just goes off the page. So this arm's kind of bent toward us. This arm's bent away from us. We can also go in and put in those little carved lines that are on the face and on the torso. And then we will clean up our sketch. So you'll go in and erase all those sketchy lines, the skeleton lines. And once you've got your outlines done, just say done in the chat box. And if you'd like to add the screw details, you can. And again, just say done when you've got him drawn out mostly. Doesn't have to be super, super perfect, just enough to where if we shade over him, it won't be distracting. So you can see I still have sketchy lines, but they're ones that I can still clean up later if I need to. All right, so I've got a decent amount of responses. Okay, so we're going to start shading now. Now, if you remember us going back to our value study practice, I don't have the sheet because it's like in the sketchbook, but you want to make sure you have a wide range of values, not just like light values where it's just like this and then it trails off. It should be a lot more than that. So what I want you to do is just below him or somewhere that you have free on the page, just do a really quick value scale from dark to light. So remember, you need 6 separate values. So I'm just gently letting off on the pencil pressure as I go. So that way I've got that visual reminder that I need all these different values somewhere in the image, especially on these pictures. They have a very wide range of values. They've got bright brights, they've got a lot of medium tones, they've definitely got those deep dark shadows. Okay, so what we're going to start with is actually kind of an even toned drawing. That way we lay out the base values, then we're going to come back and deepen the darkest ones. So I'm going to start where the darkest shadows are, but I'm just going to kind of shade them in, similar to how we kind of laid them out with the gesture shading that we did earlier on, but now we're using scumbling or feathering. So remember, either small circular movements or wide oval movements, whichever one you feel fits the area that you are shading in best, or whichever one you feel you maybe do better at. So I'm going in and shading in all those darkest shadows. I'm not pushing them super dark yet. Reason why we don't push it super dark yet is we don't want to make it so dark that everything else becomes too dark too. Because if you start really dark, you might tend to make everything super dark shadows, and not all of it is. So you can always add more value. It's a lot harder to take away value that you push too far on. So I'm just going through and shading with scumbling or feathering all of those really, really dark shadows. So same concept as gesture shading, we're just doing a lot more neatly now. And it's up to you if you go section by section or if you kind of jump around like I do. As long as in the end you've got it all down. Now this arm over here doesn't have any super deep shadows, but I'm still gonna shade them, maybe just a tiny bit lighter. And those are my kind of base dark shadows. Next, what I'm going to do is get in those kind of medium dark shadows. So like on this part of his face here, it's kind of medium dark. Make it a little lighter than those shadows are. You can start fading out where those darkest areas are, so that you start to build the form a little bit more. And when you are doing a value next to another value that's already done, so if I have like a dark value already done here and I want it to kind of fade out, you want to start by first overlapping that shadow and then fading it out. Because if you have it filled in and then you just go to shade next to it, you tend to see that line. So you want to make sure you overlap first and then fade it out. I'm getting all these kind of medium dark shadows in now. If you notice on his body here in the picture, it has that halo effect that we talked about with the sphere. So light is shining and it's kind of peeking around his body and hitting right here. So pay attention to those subtle little highlights that might be showing in the rounder areas. Now, one part that can get tricky is this part here, because if you're looking at his body, it's of course dark here, it's really bright here, but this is kind of a medium tone, but somehow we need to make it a medium tone while also maintaining a contrast. So if you look really closely, it's almost like this edge is a little bit darker. We'll just kind of shade a medium tone. But as you get closer to this edge that meets up with the dark shadow, lighten it up a little bit. So that way you maintain that contrast. And you can actually kind of see the form of how this is a flat part and this is a round part. Now this part of his arm's pretty bright, so I'm not going to add too much. There's just a very slight bit of color, like along the edge here. Very, very slight though, not very dark at all. Now once you've got both of those kind of sections of shadows shaded in, that's kind of a tongue twister. Actually his face here is kind of doing similarly to this part of his body. You're gonna go, okay, so unfortunately my video did not save that I recorded while I was doing all of this. So if you weren't here yesterday, I'm gonna do a small part. Just so you can see the steps of adding the actual value shading to the mannequins. So not the gesture shading where we kind of scribbled, but the actual scumbling and feathering technique for shading. Now I'm going to just draw maybe a second one of his arm. Why not? So I'm gonna do the skeleton. Build it out. His little scoop hand. And then I'm gonna go in and really shape out those sections. And you can kind of combine these two steps if you want to. So instead of doing those loose lines, you can just kind of not do them till you get to that. Remember, when it comes to the parts of the limbs and then the joint balls, you want to pay attention to how things are overlapping. So this overlaps over that. Coming up, overlaps under. This one overlaps over. This one overlaps over again. Then we've got his little scoop hand, and it connects like that. So that is an arm. We're going to erase all the sketchy lines so that we just have the basic contours to work with. All right, now I'm gonna go and quickly add in the screws for now, just where they are. I don't have to add many details yet. Now when you're shading, let me get you out of the shadow here. You want to make sure you lay down kind of a base of values first. So remember, when we're shading values, we want to make sure it's a nice range of values, so not just like mid values like this one. We want very dark darks to light lights, especially if the picture calls for that. Now, if you're looking at the post from today, which is Thursday, so if you're doing it Friday, go back to Thursday. The picture will be there, and it has some very, very dark shadows that are almost like black. It has a lot of different mid-tones, and then it has those highlights where the light is hitting directly. Now on his arm here, and you'll do this for the whole body first, you're going to first lay out the darkest shadows, but you don't want to press it too hard already. Reason being is you can always darken values, but it becomes a little bit hard to lighten values if you've made them very dark when they're not quite there yet. So we're going to just kind of like a medium dark charcoal, lay out where those darkest shadows are. It's similar to how we laid out the shadows for the gesture shading, except now we're using scumbling or feathering. So if you remember, feathering is those wide oval marks to create nice even shading. Scumbling is small circular marks, again, to create nice even shading. So either one is up to you. They both work. Some people like using one more than the other. Sometimes your hand just does it for you, just based on the section and how large it is and how much you're shading in. So I'm laying down those dark shadow areas. So the light's over here, shining down on him. So the light's hitting this side, it is not hitting this side. So we've got those dark shadows laid in. I think there was one like right here too. Now what we're going to do is fade that out. So we're going over the entire mannequin and adding in those midtones. So remember, to make lighter values, you just lift your pencil a little bit, you add less pressure to it, and we are just adding some kind of middle values next to that dark value. Obviously I'm just doing an arm here, so there's not a whole lot to do, but normally you would go through and do this step for the whole mannequin. That way you make sure you keep it nice and uniform and everything relates to other parts. So on the picture, this side's very dark, but this side, this arm is getting more light because the arm's bent back, so more light is able to hit it. Okay, so now we've got those dark and mid-tones in. The last thing you do is go in and really push those dark shadows. So you're going to kind of layer over it. Really push it as dark as you see it in the picture. So if it's almost black, you can make it almost black. Now what you do though is you don't just leave it like that. You need to make sure the areas around it still kind of go with it. So you're going to fade it out ever so slightly. And when it comes to fading out values, what you don't want to do is do your dark shade and then do your light shade next to it, because then you can see that line. If you're shading a dark shade then a light shade, so you've got your dark shade, you're gonna layer over it first and then fade it out, and then you've got that nice gradual change rather than seeing where the two values go up next to each other. Pushing this value really dark here. fading it out just slightly. Now if it is like a stark like cut. Okay, so my phone overheated, so this is part 2 of this one video. I believe I left off saying if you have like a stark change between shadows, that's fine. Just make sure there's still a little bit of a buffer of a fade there, otherwise it'll look like you just have chunks of shadows rather than actual shading happening. So basically you're just gonna finish off the entire drawing by adding that nice faded out value to each section. Remember when you are doing that to always overlap before you continue on that value. You don't want to do the shadow then start the next value next to it, otherwise you will see that difference instead of it being nice and gradual. So this is what it should look like when it's done. Overall, the whole project will look nicely shaded like this. You'll get a picture that you'll get a lot of pictures you can choose from of full mannequins, and they'll each have a piece of fabric. So it might be a little bit more difficult with the fabric, but that's just the added challenge. But the practice today, Thursday, and then tomorrow on Friday will just let you kind of practice that shading so that you get it down on how to see the shadows in the pictures, create them, blend them nicely, and just create a successful drawing. One last thing I want to remind you is please do not blend with your finger. I know I showed this in class, but in case you weren't there, what blending with your finger does, I will just add a little shade right here, is it smudges the pencil around. It doesn't truly blend it, it just smears it. Whereas if you're truly blending, and I will show you kind of tools to use later on for that, if you're truly blending with a blending tool, which there are some things you can use at home, you can see it actually blends it. It doesn't just smear it around, and you have a lot more control too. So please don't blend with your finger. It's okay if we see the paper grain for now, so you can see kind of the graininess. That is okay. As long as the shading's smooth, it looks good to me.